Hello everybody, welcome back to another video, and in this week's video I thought what we would do is talk about image sharpness. So why is it so important and what can we do to maximise the sharpness of our images? So let's jump straight into it and answer the first of those questions. Why is it so important? So typically what I like to do is I like to try and get my images as sharp as I possibly can in camera, and the reason for doing that is because it's very difficult to correct image sharpness issues in post-processing using the standard software that we would normally use. So for me that's Lightroom and a bit of Photoshop. Now there are specialist pieces of software that can help us to correct sharpness issues. They're not 100% perfect, but they are getting a lot better. But of course it adds additional time to the amount of time we spend post-processing our images. So for me personally, I like to try and get my images as sharp as I possibly can in camera. So now let's look at some of the ways that we can actually do that. And the biggest problem with regard to image sharpness in my experience is not using a fast enough shutter speed when you're shooting handheld. So typically what happens is you'll be shooting handheld, and when you take the shot, you press the shutter button and the camera moves very slightly, and that creates blur in the image. Now there are a couple of things that you can do about that. The first thing is to use the reciprocal rule, whatever it is, and that states that the shutter speed that you're using needs to be at least the inverse of your focal length. So if you're shooting at 50mm, you need a shutter speed of at least 1/50th of a second. And if you're shooting at 200mm, you need a shutter speed of at least 1/200th of a second. Now we landscape photographers, we're generally shooting in conditions where the light levels are very low, and it can be very difficult for us to get a shutter speed that is fast enough. It can be very difficult for us to match that reciprocal rule. Now obviously the thing that we can do is we can up the ISO, but of course that brings in all problems of its own. So if we do that, we stand a chance of introducing lots of digital noise, and we want to try and keep our images, the image quality, as high as we possibly can. So typically I like to shoot at ISO 100, that's the best quality for my camera. But that means that we're not going to be able to get a fast enough shutter speed to shoot handheld. And so that means that the best thing that we can do if we want to get our images as sharp as possible is to put our cameras on a tripod. Now of course lots of cameras or sort of lenses have built-in image stabilization. So my lens, this lens is my 24-70, my standard zoom lens. This has image stabilization, and I believe it's effective up to 4 stops. And most modern cameras, a lot of modern cameras, expensive mirrorless cameras will have IBIS, inbuilt image stabilization in the camera body itself. And so they can be quite effective when you're shooting in low light. But for me personally, the best thing that you can possibly do is put your camera on a tripod. So let's cut to me out in the field and let me tell you a little bit about my tripod. So this is my tripod. It is a Benro Mach 3 TMA 48 CXL, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the most important bit is that bit at the end, the CXL. C stands for carbon fibre. It's a carbon fibre tripod, so it's much lighter than the aluminium equivalent. That being said, this thing still weighs a ton, and XL is extra large. This tripod will extend above my head height, and I'm nearly 2 meters tall. On the top of that I have a Benro B2 ball head, and I have a Benro LPC 6D L bracket that is designed specifically for my camera, the Canon EOS 6D, and that makes it much easier for me to mount it in portrait orientation as I have here. So you've got your camera set up on a tripod, it's all nice and secure, so the next thing you need to do is make sure that you focus properly. Now the next biggest problem causing softness to images is the camera not being focused in the right point. Now most modern cameras have excellent autofocus systems, but they're far from infallible, and my camera in particular generally struggles to focus when the scene has a lack of contrast. And so what I actually prefer to do is to focus manually. Now I do that for one reason only really, and that's because I like to keep my workflow exactly the same regardless of what I'm doing. And so sometimes autofocus doesn't work for me, and so I always focus manually, and the other great thing is that allows me to pick specifically where I want to focus. This camera, quite old now, 6D, doesn't have very many autofocus points, and generally they're always in the wrong position as well. So if I focus manually, then I can pick out the precise location where I want to focus. And in the digital age, focusing manually could not be easier. For me, live view was an absolute revelation. It created a step change in my approach to photography. And focusing is one of those things where live view can really help. So if I switch on live view, what I can do is I can magnify the area that I want to focus on up to 10 times. And so that's going to be the top of this boulder. And I can, as I say, magnify that 10 times. And then I can see when I focus, when I get that perfectly sharp. So it's not just a case of focusing manually. You also need to know exactly where to focus. And I have a general rule to try and keep things as simple as I possibly can. If I don't have any foreground, then I generally try and focus on my primary subject. And in this case, in this shot of the Duke of Portland boathouse, I actually focused on the private side. But if I do have some foreground interest, then I use the hyperfocal distance as a guide. The hyperfocal distance is another one of those photography terms that sounds more complicated than it really is. In fact, it's actually quite simple. It is essentially the distance away from the camera where you need to focus in order to give you the maximum depth of field. Now, it depends on three things: the size of your sensor, the focal length of your lens, and the aperture that you're using. And today I'm using a full-frame DSLR. I have a lens, a 24-70 at 24mm, and I'm shooting at f11. And I know that the hyperfocal distance for that is somewhere in the region of about 2 meters. It's probably a little bit closer to 1.7. And the top of this rock is about 2 meters away. So I know that if I focus on that, I'm going to be sharp from about a meter in front of the camera to infinity. And so that means that so long as I've got nothing that is closer to the camera than 1 meter, everything is going to be nice and sharp. Now, although the concept of hyperfocal distance is relatively simple, calculating it can be very difficult. And to do that, I use an app called Photo Pills. And I simply input my sensor, my focal length, and my f-stop, and it will tell me what the hyperfocal distance is. So once we've got our cameras focused properly, the next thing we need to think about is selecting the correct aperture. Now, we landscape photographers typically are looking for maximum front to back sharpness and maximum depth of field. And so you would think that we would just select the smallest aperture that we have, f22 for example. But the problem by doing that, you then encounter problems with diffraction. Now, diffraction is the term that describes the phenomenon of how light is scattered when you pass it through a very small hole. And that scattering of the light impacts image sharpness. It creates a softer image. Now, that is why often you will see an image taken at f8, it will appear sharper than an image that was taken at f22. Now, you will have heard many times before, no doubt, on these videos that we're shooting at ISO 100 and f11. And f11 is considered to be a good compromise between depth of field and minimum amount of, or an acceptable level of diffraction. So what's next? Okay. Now, if you've got your camera on a tripod and you've focused in the correct location and you're using the right aperture, you're a long way to creating very sharp images. And the next things we're going to talk about are really maximizing the sharpness of those images. And typically most of them are focused on reducing the amount of vibration that's in the camera. If we get vibration in the camera, we're going to get soft images. So the first thing that we do is that we try to avoid touching the camera if at all possible. So that means that we don't want to press the shutter button to take the shot. And I use a remote shutter release. I use this. It's a little infrared remote shutter release. And that means that when I take a shot, I don't touch my camera at all. However, I am forever leaving these in my other trousers. And so typically what I'll do is I'll use the 2-second timer. And that gives the camera enough time to settle down after I've pressed the shutter button so that I don't get any camera shake when the shutter is actually fired. The next thing that we can do, so cameras are so sensitive that even the action of flipping up the mirror in my DSLR can cause vibrations that are going to impact image sharpness. So fortunately, most cameras have a mirror lockup facility, and this means that we can lock the mirror up out of the way well before we take the shot. Now, if you shoot in live view, like I do, you don't have to worry too much about that, because of course the mirror's already flipped up out of the way. And of course it's only DSLR users that this is going to cause a problem for. If you're a mirrorless shooter, you won't have to worry about that at all. Okay, so I am generally very good at remembering those first 5 things, but I often fall down at forgetting this number 6, as it were. And that is to stand still. It's as simple as that. So unless your tripod is set up on some pretty serious rock, if you move about, chances are that you're going to move the tripod. If you're on spongy ground, just as you move about, the tripod will move as well. And that will create soft images as well. And so it's very important that when you're taking shots to remember that to stand still at least while the shutter button is firing. Okay, so this is the final thing, and this is the reason why I've decided to make this video. This is what prompted me to put this video together. I was out shooting recently, and I noticed at the time that on the back of the camera, my images didn't look as sharp as they usually did. And at the time, I thought perhaps it might be haze or something like that in the atmosphere. But when I got home, I noticed that the lens I was using was dirty. It had some smears on the rear element. And so that's my final tip. Keep your lenses as clean as you possibly can. Now, I'm forever cleaning the front one, but I often forget about the rear one, and I must have got some muck on it or something like that. I think I've been shooting in the rain a lot, and maybe I've got some water in the rear element. So yeah, clean your lenses, keep your lenses clean. And that's it. Those are my 7 top tips, my 7 steps to creating sharper landscape photographs. So let me just recap those for you. Number 1, use a tripod. Number 2, focus manually. Number 3, select the correct aperture. Number 4, use a remote shutter. Number 5, use mirror lockup. Number 6, stand still. And number 7, keep your lenses clean. So I hope that's been useful. If you have any problems remembering those 7 steps, then I've got a checklist, and you can go and download that from my website. There's a link in the description below. Anyway, thanks ever so much for watching. If you found this video useful, do give it a thumbs up, or share it with your friends. And yeah, I don't really know. I never know how to end these videos. When I'm on location, I can just walk off, but I can't really do that. So I shall say goodbye, and I'll see you next time.